What we are now doing to the world, by degrading the land surfaces, by polluting the waters, and by adding greenhouse gases to the air at an unprecedented rate, all this is new in the experience of the Earth. It is mankind and his activities that are changing the environment of our planet in damaging and dangerous ways.
The words of Margaret Thatcher to the United Nations in November 1989. It was unusual for a political figure to speak out about climate change in such a provocative way.
So we're not going to be a Margaret Thatcher free zone this week.
As with all IPMs, this starts with a listener after hearing our discussion on PM about the context of Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase, "There's no such thing as society." Professor Ian Swingland wrote,
Thatcher eschewed the idea of society because of a high-table dinner at Magdalen College at Oxford. Richard Dawkins convinced her there was no such thing as society, just individuals. I, as a lowly researcher, said she should emphasise environment in her administration, which was missing at the time.
So we spoke to Professor Swingland and to the BBC's environment analyst, Roger Harriman.
My girlfriend had just won the first prize fellowship at Magdalen, and as a result I was invited to the Judge Randolph dinner in March of 1978, only 18 months after Richard Dawkins had published The Selfish Gene. And I was close to Thatcher, and I know Richard Dawkins was there, John Krebs I think was there, a lot of us who came from the zoology department in Oxford. And she was heard to say that society is the building block for the future. And immediately, many zoologists, lowly postdoctoral researchers like me, said society doesn't exist, and this was joined by a mighty chorus from those more senior than I. And this put her back, and she challenged why we were saying it. And that brought us to essentially the argument from the evolutionary ecologists, which indeed did prove that individuals mattered more than society.
Is it your belief, is it your assertion, perhaps, that Mrs. Thatcher's well-discussed views on society were perhaps put to her, she became persuaded of that evening?
I think there's some likelihood it will have affected her thinking, because at the end of the evening, after the argument that goes with those statements and protestations that society doesn't exist, she then said, well, perhaps I ought to centre on the individuals hereafter.
You were discussing the environment with her, weren't you?
Indeed I was. And we basically said to her that environment was missing from the political agenda of many administrations prior to her becoming Prime Minister. And it was about time environment became important, since those industries that, for example, embraced environment became more profitable, that the climate was undoubtedly changing, and that something had to be done about that, possibly using the private sector. Renewable energy was important, although we also said that nuclear would be an inevitability. We wanted her to grab hold of animal welfare and species conservation, and also recycling. Her question always in all of these things was, how can I make it work? How can I make it pay for itself? Will it produce a profit? Does it help individuals?
And what did she understand by environment? Bearing in mind, again, this was the end of the 70s and it might have had a different meaning to some politicians.
I'm not, Eddie, I'm not sure that she ever grabbed environment as a concept. She grabbed it as something that we lived in as individuals, and if we messed it up, we were going to suffer the consequences. And she had the responsibility and felt she ought to do something about it, but using her market approach rather than any other sort of donation approach that was going to cost the Exchequer too much money. I don't think she actually grabbed what you're asking me at all. It was just a name as far as she was concerned, and something that she ought to do something about.
Roger Harriman, people, in all the words that have been said about Baroness Thatcher of late, and there have been so many, they haven't tended to focus on the environment and her green credentials, whatever they were. What were they?
Well, Mrs. Thatcher had an absolutely remarkable effect on the environment movement and how the environment is perceived in the wider public. I think it was the fact that a Prime Minister always adds legitimacy to what they say, the role adds legitimacy, the fact that she was herself a research chemist, and the fact that she was coming from the libertarian right at a time when the environment movement was dominated by, I suppose you might say, the soft green left. lent massive weight to two speeches that she gave, which I think a lot of people may have forgotten. One of them was to the Royal Society, both at the back end of the 80s, one of them to the United Nations. They were absolutely extraordinary, blistering environmental speeches, warning of the prospect of irretrievable damage to the atmosphere, the oceans, and the Earth itself. And if you speak to the people who were running Friends of the Earth at the time, they will say their membership profile changed. You suddenly noticed the environment appearing on the front pages of the newspapers instead of the inside pages, and the front pages of serious papers, leading the BBC, which it hadn't tended to do before. It was absolutely extraordinary galvanising speeches. Now, the policy often didn't match up with the speeches, and later on she recanted in a major way, saying that climate change was some sort of leftist plot to redistribute global wealth, which it's easy to see it that way. But the effect she had on society in general and on institutions and their change was very, very profound.
I've got a quote here from Margaret Thatcher from 1982. She did say, this was commenting on the Falklands War, "When you spent half your political life dealing with humdrum issues like the environment, it's exciting to have a real crisis on your hands."
She went further than that, Eddie. I mean, Roger knows that she said at one point that she thought that climate change was just a marvellous excuse for worldwide supranational socialism.
Let me finish by asking you both how green a tint there is then to Margaret Thatcher's blue, looking back over her entire contribution. Professor, first of all.
I think Maggie Thatcher did try and at least put the environment on the map. She may have had second thoughts towards the end of her 11 and a half years, but she put it on the map, as she did many other things, and thereafter the British government and many other governments couldn't ignore it at their peril.
Oh yes, I would agree absolutely with that. And she may have recanted climate change concerns later on. A lot of environmental issues may have run completely counter to her libertarian approach and her dislike of regulation. But her intervention at the back end of the 80s to legitimise climate change and the environment, she wasn't just an ordinary Prime Minister, and for her to legitimise the environment in that way was absolutely massive.
Roger Harrabin and Professor Ian Swingland.